I never thought my life would become a legal battleground because of a heated doghouse. But there I was, standing in my driveway on a freezing January morning in Columbus, Ohio, staring at a bright orange violation notice taped to my front door. My name is Paul Patterson, and I have lived in the Meadowbrook Heights subdivision for 3 years. The place seemed perfect when I moved in. Tree-lined streets, well-maintained lawns, families who waved as they walked their dogs. The Homeowners Association promised to keep property values high and the neighborhood beautiful. I signed the papers without thinking twice about the covenants and restrictions. That was my first mistake. My second mistake was assuming that people would have basic human decency when it came to a sick animal. The notice flapped in the bitter wind as I pulled it free. The paper was heavy stock with an embossed header that read, Meadowbrook Heights HOA. My hands were already numb from the cold, and I could barely feel my fingers as I unfolded the letter. Violation notice. Unauthorized outdoor structure erected without Architectural Review Board approval. Structure must be removed within 48 hours or face daily fines of $100. Contact Linda Pemberton, HOA president, with questions. I looked over at my backyard, where my 12-year-old greyhound Biscuit was currently sleeping in her new heated pet house. The structure was maybe 3 feet high and 4 feet long, designed specifically for dogs. It was tan with brown trim, matching my house colors almost perfectly. More importantly, it was keeping my dog alive. Biscuit had been diagnosed with severe arthritis and a heart condition 3 months ago. Dr. Morrison at the Columbus Veterinary Clinic had been very clear about her needs. She required a warm, dry environment at all times. Our home's interior was fine, but Biscuit had always been an outdoor dog during the day. She loved lying in the yard, watching squirrels and basking in whatever sun Ohio decided to provide. Taking that away from her completely had made her depressed and listless. The heated pet house was the compromise. It maintained a steady 72 degrees, had proper ventilation, and allowed Biscuit to spend a few hours outside without putting her health at risk. She had been noticeably happier since I installed it 2 weeks ago. I pulled out my phone and called the number on the notice. A woman answered on the second ring. Meadowbrook Heights HOA, Linda speaking. Hi, this is Paul Patterson on Maple Drive. I just received a violation notice about my dog's heated house, and I need to explain the situation. Mr. Patterson, yes. Her voice was clipped and professional in that way that suggested she had rehearsed responses for every situation. The structure violates Section 12.3 of our covenants, which states that any outdoor structure visible from the street or neighboring properties must receive prior approval from the Architectural Review Board. My backyard is fenced. You can barely see the doghouse from the street. Mrs. Henderson reported seeing it from her second-floor window. That counts as visible. Of course it was Deborah Henderson. The woman had complained about everything from my mail arriving after 4 p.m. to the way I parked my car in my own driveway. She lived alone in the house next door and apparently spent her retirement years monitoring the neighborhood through binoculars. Linda, my dog, is sick. She has a medical condition that requires her to stay warm. I have documentation from my veterinarian. That's unfortunate, Mr. Patterson, but it doesn't change the HOA bylaws. All residents agreed to these rules when they purchased their homes. The architectural review process exists to maintain neighborhood standards and property values. What process? I need to fill out a form. Yes. The application fee is $200 and the review board meets on the 3rd Tuesday of each month. The next meeting is February 18th. I looked at my calendar. That was 5 weeks away. Linda, It's currently 17 degrees outside. My dog cannot wait 5 weeks. The violation notice gives you 48 hours to remove the structure. Once removed, you're welcome to apply for approval to reinstall it after the review process. So you want me to take away my sick dog's heat source in the middle of winter, wait over a month and hope you approve it? I don't make the rules, Mr. Patterson. I just enforce them. Have a good day. She hung up before I could respond. I stood there in my driveway, phone in hand, anger building in my chest. This was insane. I walked around to the backyard and opened the fence gate. Biscuit heard me coming and poked her gray muzzle out of the heated house. Her tail wagged slowly and she struggled to stand. The arthritis made every movement painful for her, especially in cold weather. "Hey girl," I said, kneeling down to pet her. "Don't worry, nobody's taking your house away." Her brown eyes looked up at me with complete trust. She had been my companion since I adopted her from the rescue 9 years ago. She had seen me through a divorce, a job loss, and the death of my father. There was no way I was letting some HOA bureaucrat make her final months miserable. I spent the rest of the day researching Ohio HOA law. The statutes were dense and confusing, full of legal language that seemed designed to discourage regular people from understanding their rights. What I did learn was that HOAs had significant power, but they weren't completely above the law. Reasonable accommodations had to be made for medical necessities in some cases, particularly under fair housing laws. The problem was that most of those laws applied to people, not pets. I found one promising Ohio court case from 2019 where a homeowner successfully fought an HOA rule against emotional support animals, but that was different from my situation. I needed professional help. The next morning, I took Biscuit to see Dr. Morrison. The veterinary clinic was bustling with people bringing in dogs and cats for their appointments. Dr. Morrison had been Biscuit's vet for the past 5 years, a patient woman in her 50s who genuinely cared about animals. "Paul, good to see you," she said, examining Biscuit on the metal table. "How's she doing with the heated house?" "That's actually why I'm here. My HOA is threatening to fine me if I don't remove it." Dr. Morrison's expression hardened. "Are you serious?" "Completely. I got a violation notice yesterday. They want it gone in 48 hours. She shook her head and continued examining Biscuit, listening to her heart and checking her joints. This dog cannot handle extended cold exposure. Her heart condition makes her extremely vulnerable to hypothermia, and the arthritis becomes exponentially worse in low temperatures. I'm not exaggerating when I say that forcing her to stay in an unheated space during Ohio winter could kill her. Can you put that in writing? Absolutely. Give me a few minutes. Dr. Morrison disappeared into her office while a veterinary technician stayed with Biscuit and me. The tech, a young woman named Sarah, shook her head sympathetically. "HOAs are the worst," she said. "My parents had to fight theirs just to plant a vegetable garden. Took them 8 months. Did they win? Eventually. But it was incredibly stressful. Dr. Morrison returned with an official letter on clinic letterhead. It detailed Biscuit's medical conditions, the treatments she was receiving, and the specific environmental requirements necessary for her health and survival. The letter stated clearly that the heated pet house was not a luxury but a medical necessity, and that removing it would constitute a direct threat to Biscuit's life. "This should help," Dr. Morrison said, handing me the letter. "And if you need me to testify or provide additional documentation, I'm happy to do so." "This is ridiculous." I thanked her and paid for the visit, then drove straight to the HOA office. Meadowbrook Heights had a small administrative building near the entrance to the subdivision, a brick structure that also housed a gym and community room. Linda Pemberton's office was on the first floor, behind a door marked HOA Administration. I knocked and entered without waiting for a response. Linda looked up from her computer, clearly annoyed at the interruption. She was exactly what I had imagined based on our phone call. Mid-50s, short blonde hair styled in that specific suburban mom cut that required weekly salon maintenance. She wore a navy blazer over a white blouse, and her desk was meticulously organized. "Mr. Patterson, I assume you're here about the violation." "I am." I placed Dr. Morrison's letter on her desk. "My veterinarian has confirmed that the heated pet house is medically necessary for my dog's survival. I'm requesting a reasonable accommodation." Linda picked up the letter and scanned it quickly, her expression never changing. When she finished, she set it down and folded her hands. "Mr. Patterson, I'm sympathetic to your dog's condition. I really am. But HOA rules don't include provisions for pet accommodations. The architectural standards exist to protect everyone's property values. If we allow one person to bypass the approval process, it sets a precedent that undermines the entire system. This isn't about property values. This is about keeping a living creature from suffering. That's your perspective, Mrs. Henderson's perspective is that unsightly structures in the neighborhood affect her quality of life and home value. Both perspectives are valid. Unsightly. It's a dog house that matches my exterior paint colors. You can barely see it unless you're actively spying on my property. Linda's jaw tightened. Mrs. Henderson is not spying. She has every right to enjoy the view from her own home windows. And I have every right to keep my dog alive. Remove the structure by tomorrow evening, or the fines begin. If you wish to apply for future approval, the application forms are available on our website." She turned back to her computer, dismissing me. I wanted to argue more to make her understand how unreasonable this was, but I could see it would be pointless. Linda had the kind of rigid adherence to rules that made compassion impossible. In her mind, she was protecting the neighborhood. In reality, she was terrorizing a sick dog. I left the office and sat in my car for several minutes, trying to calm down. My phone rang. It was my friend Marcus, who lived 3 streets over in the same subdivision. "Hey man, I heard you got into it with the HOA," he said. "News travels fast. Deborah Henderson is telling everyone that you're refusing to follow community standards. What's going on?" I explained the situation. Marcus listened quietly, then swore. "That's messed up. Listen, you need to go to the next HOA meeting. They're held monthly and homeowners can address the board during the open forum. It's tomorrow night." "Tomorrow, that's perfect timing. Just be prepared." Linda runs those meetings like a dictator, and she doesn't like being challenged. Bring your vet letter and stay calm. If you lose your temper, she'll use it against you. I thanked Marcus and spent the rest of the day preparing. I made copies of Dr. Morrison's letter, researched similar cases from other states, and practiced what I would say. I wasn't a public speaker by nature. I worked as a software developer and spent most of my time in front of a computer. The idea of standing up in front of the HOA board made my stomach churn, but I didn't have a choice. The next evening, I arrived at the community center at 6:30 for the 7 o'clock meeting. The parking lot was already half full. Apparently, these meetings drew a decent crowd. Inside, the community room had been set up with rows of folding chairs facing a long table where the board members sat. Linda was in the center, shuffling papers. To her left was Frank Morrison, the vice president, a retired accountant who always wore plaid shirts. To her right was Patricia Chen, the treasurer, a real estate agent who had sold me my house. I took a seat in the third row and waited. Other homeowners filtered in. chatting quietly. I recognized some faces from the neighborhood but didn't know most people by name. At exactly 7, Linda called the meeting to order by tapping her gavel on the table. "Good evening, everyone. Welcome to the February meeting of the Meadowbrook Heights Homeowners Association. We'll begin with approval of last month's minutes." The meeting proceeded with bureaucratic efficiency. The board approved the minutes. Patricia gave a financial report, and Frank discussed upcoming landscaping contracts for the common areas. It was all painfully boring until Linda reached the section labeled Homeowner Forum. "We have 2 residents signed up to speak tonight. First is Susan Wright regarding tree maintenance on Oakwood Drive." Susan, an elderly woman from the back row, stood and complained about a dead tree branch that was hanging over the street. She was worried it would fall and damage someone's car. Linda assured her that the HOA would send someone to inspect it. Susan sat down, satisfied. Next we have Paul Patterson regarding a recent violation notice. I stood, my heart pounding. Every eye in the room turned toward me. I walked to the front and faced the board, holding my folder of documents. "Thank you for hearing me. As Linda mentioned, I received a violation notice about a heated pet house in my backyard. I'm here to request that the board grant a reasonable accommodation based on medical necessity." I handed copies of Dr. Morrison's letter to each board member and several audience members. Linda glanced at hers but didn't read it thoroughly. "Mr. Patterson submitted a veterinary letter regarding his dog's health conditions," Linda said to the room. "However, as I've explained to him, our architectural standards don't include exceptions for pet structures. The proper procedure is to submit an application for review." "I understand the procedure," I said, keeping my voice steady, "but the timing doesn't work. The review board doesn't meet for 5 weeks. My dog cannot survive 5 weeks in the cold without this heated house. Dr. Morrison's letter makes it clear that removing the structure could be fatal." Frank leaned forward. "Paul, I appreciate your situation, but if we bend the rules for you, what happens when the next person wants an exception? Where do we draw the line?" "You draw the line at medical necessity. This isn't cosmetic. This isn't about personal preference. This is about preventing an animal from dying." Patricia spoke up, her tone more sympathetic than the others. "Could you bring your dog inside during the cold weather? That would solve the problem. She needs access to outdoor space during the day. Being confined inside 24/7 has made her depressed. The heated house allows her to be outside safely while staying warm. It's the best compromise for her physical and mental health." "Mr. Patterson," Linda said, her voice cold, "this board is responsible for maintaining property values for 400 homes. We cannot allow individual preferences to override community standards, regardless of the emotional appeal." "This isn't emotional appeal. This is medical documentation from a licensed veterinarian. For a dog, Mr. Patterson, not a person. Our bylaws don't recognize pets as requiring accommodations." Murmurs rippled through the audience. I heard someone behind me whisper, "That's harsh." Deborah Henderson stood up from her seat in the front row. Of course she was here. She looked exactly as I had pictured her. Perfectly coiffed silver hair, expensive wool coat, and an expression of permanent disapproval. "If I may add something," Deborah said, "I'm the one who reported this violation. Mr. Patterson's structure is visible from my bedroom window and it's an eyesore. Beyond that, allowing him to install unapproved structures sets a dangerous precedent. What's next? Sheds, gazebos, pink flamingos." "A heated dog house is not equivalent to pink flamingos," I said, struggling to keep my temper in check. "It's a slippery slope," Deborah continued. "I've lived in Meadowbrook Heights for 15 years. I moved here specifically because the HOA maintains standards. I don't want to wake up one day and find the neighborhood looking like a junkyard. A medical device for a sick animal is not junk. It's still an unapproved structure. Linda banged her gavel. Order, please. This debate is not productive. Mr. Patterson, the board's decision stands. You have until midnight tonight to remove the structure, or fines will begin accruing tomorrow morning at $100 per day. You're welcome to submit an application for future approval. Future approval doesn't help my dog now. That's not the board's concern. Next item on the agenda. I stood there for a moment, shocked at the callousness. Around the room, several people looked uncomfortable, but no one spoke up. I returned to my seat, my hands shaking with anger and frustration. The meeting continued for another 30 minutes, covering mundane topics like pool maintenance and guest parking policies. I barely heard any of it. When Linda finally adjourned, people filed out quickly. A few gave me sympathetic looks, but most avoided eye contact. Marcus caught up with me in the parking lot. That was brutal, man. Linda was way out of line. What do I do now? I can't let Biscuit freeze, but I also can't afford $100 daily fines indefinitely. You need a lawyer. This is beyond HOA politics. They're being unreasonable, and there might be legal grounds to fight it. Lawyers are expensive. So are daily fines. Look, my wife's cousin is an attorney who handles HOA disputes. Let me get you his number. Marcus texted me the contact information for David Rosenberg, an attorney based in downtown Columbus. I thanked him and drove home, my mind racing. When I arrived, I went straight to the backyard to check on Biscuit. She was curled up in her heated house, warm and comfortable. I couldn't imagine forcing her to give this up. That night, I didn't remove the structure. I knew the fines would start accumulating, but I was willing to fight this battle. Some things were more important than money. The next morning, I called David Rosenberg's office. His secretary scheduled an appointment for later that week. In the meantime, I received a formal fine notice in the mail. $100 for day one of non-compliance. The notice included a warning that continued violations could result in a lien being placed on my property. The legal threats were escalating quickly. I showed up at David's office on Thursday afternoon. His practice was in a converted Victorian house near downtown, with creaky wooden floors and walls lined with law books. David himself was younger than I expected, maybe early 40s, with a receding hairline and friendly demeanor. "Paul, good to meet you," he said, shaking my hand. "Marcus told me about your situation. Let's take a look at what we're dealing with." I showed him everything. The original violation notice, the veterinary letter, the fine notices, and a copy of the Meadowbrook Heights bylaws that I had downloaded from their website. David read through it all carefully, occasionally making notes on a legal pad. "Okay," he said after about 20 minutes. "Here's the situation. Ohio law gives HOAs broad authority to enforce their covenants and restrictions. However, that authority isn't unlimited. There are a few angles we can pursue, such as: first, we can argue that the HOA is being unreasonable in refusing to expedite the review process, given the medical emergency. Most judges don't like seeing HOAs act in ways that cause unnecessary harm. Second, we can look at whether their bylaws are written in a way that allows for emergency accommodations. If there's any ambiguity, we can exploit it. And if none of that works, then we file a lawsuit and take it to court. That's expensive and time-consuming, but it might be necessary. The good news is that cases like this sometimes settle quickly once the HOA realizes you're serious. They don't want the publicity or legal costs any more than you do. How much are we talking?" My retainer for HOA cases is $2,000. If it goes to trial, costs could run $10,000 to $15,000, depending on how long it drags out. I felt my stomach drop. I had some savings, but that would wipe out a significant portion of it. Still, what choice did I have? Let's start with the retainer, I said. See if we can resolve this without going to court. David agreed and had me sign some paperwork. Over the next week, he sent a formal demand letter to the HOA, arguing that they had a legal obligation to provide reasonable accommodations for medical necessities, even those involving animals. He cited several precedents from other states and threatened litigation if they didn't allow the heated pet house to remain. The HOA's response came quickly. Their attorney, a firm called Henderson and Associates, sent a letter dismissing David's arguments entirely. They claimed that HOA bylaws were contractual obligations that I had agreed to when purchasing my home, and that no Ohio law required accommodations for pets. They also noted that my daily fines were now up to $700 and would continue accumulating. They're playing hardball, David said over the phone. I think they want to force you to back down by making the financial pressure unbearable. I'm not backing down. Then we file suit. I'll start drafting the complaint today. While David worked on the legal paperwork, my life became increasingly stressful. The HOA sent me violation notices almost daily, each one adding another $100 to my total. I stopped opening them after a while, just piling them on my kitchen counter. Deborah Henderson seemed to be monitoring my backyard constantly, probably reporting back to Linda about whether the heated house was still there. Other neighbors had mixed reactions. Some quietly supported me, leaving encouraging notes in my mailbox or stopping by to check on Biscuit. Others sided with the HOA, believing that rules were rules and exceptions would lead to chaos. One guy, Roger, who lived 2 doors down, even yelled at me while I was getting my mail. "You're going to tank all our property values with this nonsense," he said. "Just get rid of the damn dog house." "You're free to buy my house if you're so concerned about property values," I shot back. "You're a selfish jerk, you know that, and you're heartless." We didn't speak again after that. David filed the lawsuit in Franklin County Court in early February. The complaint alleged that the HOA was acting in an arbitrary and capricious manner by refusing to accommodate a documented medical necessity, and that their actions constituted a breach of their fiduciary duty to act in the best interests of all homeowners, not just those who complained the loudest. We requested an injunction preventing the HOA from enforcing the fines while the case was pending. The HOA responded by doubling down. Their attorney filed a motion to dismiss, arguing that the court had no jurisdiction over private HOA matters and that my claims had no legal merit. They also filed a counterclaim for the accumulated fines, which were now approaching $3,000. The hearing for my injunction request was scheduled for March 3rd, about 3 weeks after we filed. Those weeks felt like years. I went to work every day trying to focus on coding projects, but my mind was constantly on the lawsuit. Biscuit, oblivious to the drama surrounding her, continued enjoying her heated house, blissfully unaware that it was the center of a legal battle. Dr. Morrison called me one afternoon to check in. "Paul, how's everything going? I saw that you filed a lawsuit. It's been rough. The HOA isn't backing down and the legal costs are adding up. I spoke with some colleagues and we want to help. Several veterinarians in the area are willing to sign a joint statement supporting your case. We can present it as expert testimony about animal welfare. That would be amazing. Thank you. These HOA situations make me so angry. Animals deserve protection too. Let me know what you need." Her support meant more than she probably realized. Fighting this battle felt incredibly lonely most of the time, and knowing that professionals agreed with me helped validate my decision to keep fighting. The injunction hearing arrived on a cold, gray morning. I wore my only suit and met David at the courthouse downtown. The building was an imposing stone structure with marble floors and high ceilings. We went through security and made our way to the courtroom on the 4th floor. The HOA was represented by a stern-looking woman in her 60s named Margaret Phillips. She had a reputation, David told me, for being aggressive and extremely effective. Linda Pemberton and Frank Morrison sat behind her at the defendant's table. Judge Catherine Reynolds presided over the hearing. She was a middle-aged black woman with an air of no-nonsense competence. After the bailiff called the court to order, Judge Reynolds reviewed the file briefly and then looked up. "Counsel, this is a request for a preliminary injunction preventing the HOA from enforcing fines related to an outdoor pet structure. Mr. Rosenberg, you're the plaintiff. Make your case." David stood and approached the lectern. He argued clearly and persuasively that the HOA's refusal to accommodate Biscuit's medical needs was unreasonable and caused irreparable harm. He presented Dr. Morrison's letter and the additional veterinary statements we had gathered. He emphasized that I wasn't asking to violate community standards permanently, just for a temporary accommodation until the formal review process could be completed. Margaret Phillips countered by arguing that the court had no authority to interfere with private HOA governance. She claimed that I had signed a contract agreeing to abide by all rules and regulations, and that allowing me to bypass those rules would create chaos throughout the subdivision. She also suggested that I could simply keep Biscuit inside, making the outdoor structure unnecessary. "Your Honor," David responded, "the defendant's position essentially requires Mr. Patterson to choose between his dog's quality of life and avoiding financial ruin through daily fines. That's not a reasonable choice. The HOA has the ability to expedite its review process, but has chosen not to. They're manufacturing this crisis." Judge Reynolds listened carefully, occasionally asking questions. She seemed particularly interested in the medical documentation and whether the HOA bylaws included any provisions for emergency accommodations. "Miss Phillips," the judge said, "does your client's governing documents include any language about expedited reviews in emergency situations?" "No, Your Honor. The bylaws specify that the Architectural Review Board meets monthly, and all applications follow the same process. So if someone's house was damaged in a storm and they needed to make immediate exterior repairs, they'd have to wait a month for approval. In practice, the board has made exceptions for emergency repairs to homes. But this is different. This is a pet structure. A pet structure that a licensed veterinarian says is medically necessary. For a dog, Your Honor, not a person." Judge Reynolds's expression suggested she wasn't impressed with that argument. She paused, reviewing her notes, then looked up. "Here's what troubles me about this case. The HOA is technically correct that Mr. Patterson violated their procedures by installing the structure without prior approval. However, their response to a documented medical situation has been rigid to the point of being punitive. Charging $100 per day, when you have the ability to hold an emergency review, seems designed to coerce rather than to enforce reasonable community standards." "Your Honor, if we start granting exceptions," Margaret began. "Counsel, I've heard the slippery slope argument. I'm not persuaded. I'm granting the preliminary injunction. The HOA is barred from collecting fines related to this structure while the case is pending. Furthermore, I'm ordering the HOA to hold an expedited architectural review within 2 weeks. If they approve the structure, this case is moot. If they deny it, we'll have a fuller hearing on the merits. Any questions? No, Your Honor, David said, barely containing a smile. Margaret looked furious but said nothing. Good. My clerk will prepare the order. Court is adjourned. The gavel came down, and I felt a wave of relief wash over me. It wasn't a complete victory, but it was something. The fines were stopped, at least temporarily, and the HOA would have to actually review my application instead of hiding behind bureaucratic delays. Outside the courtroom, David shook my hand. That went better than I expected. Judge Reynolds clearly saw through their tactics. What happens now? You need to submit your formal application immediately. Make it as thorough as possible. Include photos showing how the structure matches your home. Emphasize the medical necessity, and maybe even include statements from supportive neighbors if you can get them. The review board will meet, and we'll see what they decide. I went home and spent the weekend working on the application. I took dozens of photos from different angles, showing how the heated pet house blended into my backyard. I got written statements from Marcus and 2 other neighbors who supported my cause. I included fresh documentation from Dr. Morrison, and even added a timeline showing how Biscuit's health had improved since the structure was installed. The application, along with the $200 fee, was submitted to the HOA office on Monday morning. The expedited review was scheduled for March 17th. In the days leading up to the meeting, I tried to gauge the mood of the review board members. The board consisted of 5 people: Linda Pemberton, Frank Morrison, Patricia Chen, and 2 others I didn't know well. Patricia had seemed somewhat sympathetic during the general meeting, but the others were harder to read. Marcus did some reconnaissance for me, talking to people who knew the board members. The word was that Frank was a stickler for rules but could be swayed by practical arguments. Patricia genuinely cared about the community and didn't like seeing people suffer. The other 2 members were wild cards. The night before the review, I couldn't sleep. I kept imagining different scenarios, most of them ending with a denial and a return to accumulating fines. Biscuit sensed my stress and stayed close to me, resting her head on my lap while I sat on the couch. "We're going to get through this," I told her, scratching behind her ears. "One way or another." The Architectural Review Board meeting was held at 6 p.m. in the HOA office. Unlike the general meetings, this was a smaller affair. Just the 5 board members, me and David, who attended as my attorney. Linda sat at the head of the table, looking as stern as ever. "Mr. Patterson, we're here to review your application for the heated pet structure currently installed in your backyard. You have 15 minutes to present your case." I stood and distributed copies of my application materials. Then I walked them through everything: Biscuit's medical conditions, Dr. Morrison's recommendations, the structure's design and placement, and the improvements in Biscuit's health since installation. I showed the photos demonstrating how the structure matched my home's aesthetics. I read the statements from supportive neighbors. This isn't about defying HOA authority, I concluded. It's about finding a reasonable solution that protects my dog's health without harming the neighborhood's appearance or property values. I've gone above and beyond to make sure this structure is tasteful and necessary. I'm asking you to recognize that sometimes compassion needs to factor into your decisions. Linda looked unmoved, but I noticed Patricia nodding slightly. Frank was reviewing the photos carefully. "Questions from the board?" Linda asked. Frank spoke first. "Paul, the photos do show that the structure is well placed and matches your home. My concern is precedent. If we approve this, what happens when someone else wants to install something?" "Then you evaluate each case on its merits," I said. I'm not asking for a blanket exception to the rules. I'm asking for recognition of a documented medical need. The next person would have to show similar necessity. Patricia raised her hand. I've driven by Paul's house several times in the past week. Honestly, if Mrs. Henderson hadn't pointed out the structure, I wouldn't have noticed it. It's not visible from the street at all. It's visible from my bedroom window, Deborah said from the back of the room. I hadn't even realized she was there. Mrs. Henderson, this is a closed board meeting, Linda said. You're welcome to observe, but please don't interrupt. Deborah looked offended but said nothing more. The board discussed among themselves for several minutes. I couldn't hear everything they were saying, but the body language suggested disagreement. Finally, Linda called for a vote. All in favor of approving Mr. Patterson's application. Patricia raised her hand immediately. After a pause, Frank raised his too. One of the other board members, a man named Thomas, also voted yes. That was 3 out of 5. Motion passes, Linda said, her tone making it clear she wasn't happy. Mr. Patterson, your heated pet structure is approved. However, approval is conditional on the structure remaining in its current location and maintaining its current appearance. Any modifications require additional review. Thank you, I said, relief flooding through me. I appreciate the board's consideration. Meeting adjourned. David and I left quickly before anyone could change their minds. Outside, he clapped me on the shoulder. Congratulations. You won. I can't believe it actually worked. Sometimes the system does what it's supposed to. Enjoy it. I drove home feeling lighter than I had in weeks. When I got there, I went straight to the backyard and opened the heated pet house. Biscuit looked up at me with those trusting brown eyes. Good news, girl. You get to keep your house. She wagged her tail slowly, and I sat down beside her, not caring that the ground was cold and damp. We stayed there together as the sun set, and for the first time in months, I felt like everything was going to be okay. But the peace didn't last long. 2 weeks after the approval, I received a letter from Henderson and Associates, the law firm representing the HOA. They were demanding payment of all accumulated fines from before the injunction was granted. The total was just over $3,000. I immediately called David. They can't do that, can they? The judge's order stopped the fines. The order stopped future fines. It didn't necessarily void the past ones. Let me review the exact wording of the injunction. He called me back an hour later with bad news. Paul, technically, they have a case. The injunction prevented them from continuing to assess fines, but it didn't explicitly forgive the fines that had already accumulated. We can argue that those fines were unjust given the circumstances, but it's not a slam dunk. So I might owe $3,000 even though I won, possibly. We can negotiate. Let me reach out to their attorney and see if we can settle for a reduced amount. The next few weeks were consumed by negotiations. Margaret Phillips refused to budge from the full amount at first, insisting that I had violated the HOA covenants and owed the full penalty. David countered by threatening to file an amended lawsuit seeking damages for the HOA's unreasonable conduct. He also pointed out that a judge might take a dim view of the HOA trying to collect fines that were based on an emergency situation. Eventually, they agreed to settle for $1,200, with the understanding that I would drop any further legal action. It wasn't ideal, but it was better than $3,000. I paid the settlement and tried to put the whole mess behind me. Life gradually returned to normal. Biscuit continued to use her heated pet house throughout the remainder of the winter and into the early spring. Her health remained stable, and she seemed happier than she had been in years. Dr. Morrison was pleased with her progress during our follow-up visits. The neighborhood slowly moved on from the drama. Deborah Henderson still glared at me whenever we crossed paths, but she stopped actively harassing me. Linda Pemberton continued running the HOA with an iron fist, but she left me alone. I heard through the grapevine that the whole situation had created some backlash against her leadership, with several homeowners questioning whether the organization was being managed appropriately. In May, there were elections for the HOA board. I didn't run for a position myself, but several reform-minded candidates did. Patricia Chen ran for president against Linda and won in a fairly decisive vote. The neighborhood, it seemed, was ready for leadership that prioritized people over rigid rule enforcement. Patricia's first act as president was to revise the architectural review process to include provisions for emergency accommodations. The new policy stated that homeowners facing genuine emergencies could request expedited reviews within 72 hours, and that medical necessities for both people and pets would be given serious consideration. It wasn't a perfect policy, but it was a significant improvement. I attended the meeting where the new policy was adopted and thanked Patricia afterward. "You shouldn't have had to fight so hard," she said. "What happened to you was wrong, and I'm glad we could make some changes to prevent it from happening to someone else. I appreciate that." This whole experience has been eye-opening. HOAs can be a force for good, but they need to remember they're serving people, not the other way around. We lost sight of that. Summer arrived, and with it, warm weather that made the heated pet house less necessary. Biscuit still used it as a regular dog house, appreciating the shade and shelter it provided. I added a small fan to keep it cool during the hottest days. Life was peaceful. In August, I came home from work to find a notice on my door. My heart sank, assuming it was another HOA violation. Instead, it was a handwritten note from a neighbor 3 streets over named Jennifer. "Paul, I heard about what you went through with the HOA last winter. My cat has kidney disease and needs a heated outdoor shelter. I was afraid to install one because of what happened to you, but I saw the new policies passed in May. Would you be willing to talk to me about your experience? I want to make sure I do everything right." I called Jennifer that evening and spent an hour walking her through the application process, showing her photos of Biscuit's heated house and sharing tips on how to present a medical case effectively. She was grateful and relieved. "I was so worried they'd make me get rid of it like they tried to do to you," she said. "The new board is much more reasonable, but document everything, get a vet letter, and make your application thorough. That's the key." Jennifer followed my advice, and her application was approved within a week. No drama, no fines, no legal battles, just a reasonable process handled reasonably. It was how things should have worked from the beginning. As fall approached and temperatures started dropping again, I fired up the heater in Biscuit's house for another season. She was now 13 years old, and Dr. Morrison warned me that she probably didn't have more than another year or 2 left. Her heart condition was stable but slowly worsening, and the arthritis continued to progress despite medication. "Make sure she's comfortable," Dr. Morrison said during our September checkup. "That's the most important thing at this stage." Biscuit was comfortable, thanks to the heated house that had caused so much trouble. On cold mornings, I'd watch her settle into the warmth, content, and relaxed. It was worth every dollar I'd spent, every stressful conversation, every legal battle. In October, a local newspaper ran a feature story about my case. A reporter had heard about the lawsuit through public court records and thought it illustrated broader issues with HOA governance in Ohio. I agreed to be interviewed, and the article ran with the headline, "Man Fights HOA to Save Sick Dog." It included quotes from me, David, Dr. Morrison, and even Patricia Chen, who spoke about the reforms that had been implemented. The article generated a lot of attention. I received emails and calls from people across the state who had their own HOA horror stories. Some asked for advice, others just wanted to share their experiences. It was both validating and depressing to realize how common these conflicts were. One call stood out. It was from a state legislator named Representative Julia Kim, who represented a district in the Columbus suburbs. "Mr. Patterson, I read your story and it resonated with me. I've been hearing from constituents for years about HOA overreach, but I haven't seen a clear path to reform. Would you be willing to testify if I introduce legislation to regulate HOA governance in Ohio?" "Absolutely. What kind of legislation?" "I'm thinking about requirements for emergency review processes, limits on fine amounts, and protections for medical accommodations." Your case highlighted gaps in current law that need to be addressed. I'm happy to help however I can. Representative Kim drafted a bill over the following months, and I stayed in touch with her office, providing input based on my experience. The bill, dubbed the Homeowner Protection Act, was introduced in the Ohio House of Representatives in January of the next year. It included provisions for expedited reviews in emergency situations, caps on daily fines, requirements for mediation before litigation, and explicit protections for medical accommodations for both people and pets. The bill faced opposition from HOA management companies and some real estate lobbying groups, who argued it would make HOA governance too difficult and reduce property values. But it also had strong grassroots support from homeowners who had been victimized by overzealous HOAs. I testified at a committee hearing in March, telling my story to a room full of legislators. I brought photos of Biscuit and copies of Dr. Morrison's medical letters. I explained how a simple act of caring for a sick animal had turned into a legal nightmare, and how reasonable reforms could prevent others from going through the same ordeal. "No one should have to choose between their pet's health and financial ruin," I said in my testimony. "And no community organization should have the power to punish people for acts of basic compassion." This bill wouldn't prevent HOAs from maintaining standards. It would just ensure that those standards are applied fairly and humanely. The committee voted to advance the bill, and it passed the full House in April with bipartisan support. The Senate passed it in June with minor amendments. Governor Melissa Wright signed it into law in July, with me and several other affected homeowners present at the signing ceremony. This law protects Ohioans from unreasonable HOA actions while preserving the legitimate purposes that these organizations serve, Governor Wright said. "It's a balanced approach that puts people first." I never expected to become an advocate for HOA reform. I was just a guy trying to keep his dog warm. But sometimes circumstance pushes you into situations you never imagined, and you either shrink from them or rise to meet them. Biscuit passed away peacefully in October at the age of 14. Dr. Morrison said her heart simply gave out, which wasn't unexpected given her condition. I was with her at the end, holding her in the backyard she had loved so much. She died in my arms on a sunny autumn afternoon, surrounded by falling leaves. I buried her in the backyard near her heated house, which I left standing as a memorial. The HOA didn't object. Patricia Chen even sent a condolence card. The loss hit me harder than I expected. Biscuit had been my constant companion for nearly a decade. The house felt empty without her. But I took comfort in knowing that her final years had been comfortable, that she had been able to enjoy her backyard and stay warm during the cold winters. The fight had been worth it. In the months after her death, I received letters from people whose pets had been helped by the law we'd passed. One woman in Cleveland wrote to say that her dog with diabetes needed climate-controlled shelter, and her HOA had approved her application within days, thanks to the new state requirements. A man in Cincinnati thanked me for making it possible for his elderly cat to have outdoor access, despite his HOA's previous objections. These letters meant more to me than anything else. Biscuit's story had helped other animals, and that felt like a fitting legacy. The following spring, I adopted a new dog from the same greyhound rescue where I'd found Biscuit. His name was Murphy, a 4-year-old with boundless energy and a completely different personality. He was healthy and didn't need a heated house, but I left Biscuit standing anyway. Murphy used it as a regular shelter, and sometimes I'd see him sleeping in there, and I'd think of Biscuit. The neighborhood continued to evolve under Patricia's leadership. The HOA became less about rigid enforcement and more about genuine community building. Property values remained stable, proving that compassion and standards weren't mutually exclusive. Linda Pemberton moved to Florida shortly after losing the presidency, and I never saw her again. Deborah Henderson stayed but mellowed somewhat, or at least she stopped spying on everyone quite so aggressively. Marcus and I remained good friends, often walking our dogs together around the subdivision. He'd occasionally joke about the great heated dog-house war, and we'd laugh about how absurd the whole thing had been. "You know what the craziest part is?" Marcus said one evening as we walked. "If they'd just been reasonable from the start, none of this would have happened. They could have held an emergency review, approved your doghouse in a week and moved on. Instead, they created a legal mess, cost themselves thousands in legal fees, lost the presidency, and inspired state legislation that limits their power. All because they couldn't show basic compassion." "Pride is a hell of a drug," I said. "You did good, man. Biscuit would be proud." "I hope so." Years later, I still live in Meadowbrook Heights. The subdivision is home now, filled with memories both difficult and joyful. The Homeowner Protection Act remains in effect across Ohio, helping countless residents navigate HOA conflicts more fairly. I occasionally get contacted by people facing similar situations in other states, asking for advice or requesting that I share my story with their legislators. I always help when I can, because at the end of the day, this was never really about a dog house. It was about whether we as a society prioritize rules over compassion, bureaucracy over humanity, power over kindness. Those questions matter far beyond HOA disputes. They shape how we treat each other in every aspect of life. Biscuit taught me to fight for what's right, even when it's hard, even when the system seems stacked against you. She taught me that love sometimes requires sacrifice, and that standing up to injustice is worth the cost. Those lessons have stayed with me. I visit her grave regularly, usually in the quiet evening hours when the neighborhood is settling down for the night. Murphy comes with me, patient and understanding in his own way. We sit together in the backyard, and I tell Biscuit about the changes that happened because of her, about the animals who are warmer and safer because she needed a heated house, and I refuse to back down. The heated pet house still stands, weathered now but sturdy. It's a reminder of everything we went through, of a fight that shouldn't have been necessary but was worth having. Sometimes I see other dogs in the neighborhood with their own approved heated houses, and I smile, knowing that their owners didn't have to wage the battles I did. Progress isn't always dramatic or sweeping. Sometimes it comes in small increments, one reasonable accommodation at a time. Sometimes it starts with something as simple as keeping a sick dog warm during winter. But those small moments of progress matter. They accumulate over time, building toward a more compassionate society where power is balanced by humanity, where rules serve people rather than enslaving them. That's Biscuit's legacy. That's what came from one heated doghouse, one stubborn owner, one unreasonable HOA, and one fight that changed not just my life, but the lives of countless others across Ohio. And in the end, sitting in my backyard with Murphy sleeping beside me and Biscuit's memory surrounding us, I know it was all worth it. Every moment of stress, every dollar spent, every frustrating conversation, every legal battle. Because some things are worth fighting for, and the ones who depend on us most deserve our absolute best effort. That's what love demands. That's what compassion requires. And that's what I'll always remember about the great heated doghouse war of Meadowbrook Heights.